need to once again welcome the people who are just attending. I've seen now that the numbers have grown since we first started. To all the newcomers, you have not missed anything. Our guest speaker is about to begin, and I will do a quick introduction again for those who have missed the introduction. Her name is Marianne Zimmerman. She joins us all the way from Philadelphia in the USA. She has a master's degree in library and information science and a real passion with research and publishing. Without any further ado, I'd like now to ask Marianne Zimmerman to please share her screen and begin the presentation on the article publishing process. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Theron. So today I will be walking through some details about publishing articles in journals. Thank you everyone for attending. As Theron said, I'm a senior publisher of health and medical journals for Elsevier. My background in publishing spans several content types. So I've worked on books and journals, various digital products, and I've also been lucky enough to cover a range of subject areas from nursing and health professions to some life sciences, virology, and my current portfolio is allergy, immunology, and gastroenterology. So I have a pretty broad range. I'm certainly missing some of the social sciences, but I can speak to that if there are any questions as well. As Theron said, I also have some experience in delivering book publishing workshops in Tanzania, I guess about 5 or 6 years ago now. I spent a month in Dar es Salaam, and we did a number of book publishing workshops with a variety of different individuals. So we worked with some publishing companies who were established, some who were just getting started. We talked to a number of librarians and people at academic institutions. So I'm very happy to be here today and to speak with you all. So this is just a quick agenda. I'm going to cover a range of topics today that will hopefully provide some guidance on the publishing process. A lot of these will cover, I've received a number of questions already, and I've seen some pop up in the chat. I'm hoping some of what we cover here will answer those questions, or at least provide some more information about what you're looking for or what resources you can access. So we'll look a little bit at planning your article. That includes how to structure your article, how to choose a journal that will best fit your research, what happens once you submit to a journal, and how to improve your chances of having a paper accepted. If you have questions while we go through, please do enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll hopefully have some time to cover some of them at the end of the presentation. I can also respond to additional questions after the workshop. So before we begin, it would be helpful to get an idea of people's experience with publishing, of everybody on the line. So if you don't mind answering the poll question that appears on your screen, we can see what the range of experience is within the group. So we'll give you a minute or two to respond. It's a very basic question, just basically asking, have you had a paper published in an academic journal? So yes, no, you've submitted a paper, but it was not accepted, or you currently have a paper under review at a journal. And like I said, we'll be covering a range of topics. So this one, it doesn't matter if you've never submitted anywhere. But this is just helpful context for our conversation today.
We will allow the audience about a minute or two to participate in the polling session, and thereafter we will get the results before moving on to the next slide. Well, there we have it, Mary. Have you had a paper published in the academic journal? And 51% of our audience who have participated have said yes. We have 34% that have said no. Have submitted a paper, was not accepted, was 7%. And paper is currently under review at a journal is at 9%.
Great, so we have quite a range, so that's good. So for some of you who have published before, some of this might be, hang on one second, I'm just trying to readjust this to make sure. So are you seeing my screen in the notes view, or are you seeing presenter mode at this point? Sorry.
It's presenter mode, Mary.
Okay, good. I was going to say my screen is showing something slightly different. Okay, so that's great. Thank you all for participating in the poll. That is very helpful. So as I said, we're going to start with an overview.
Mary,
yes.
If you can click share screen and select presentation.
Right.
Instead of sharing your screen, because we can see your notes and the presentation.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. Okay, is that better?
That's it, yeah. So if you click share screen and select the presentation and not the screen option.
Right, and then I'm still not in presenter mode. Hang on. Sorry, everybody.
No worries, Mary.
Okay, we can see the full screen of the full view of your presentation.
Okay, great.
Great.
Great. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so we're going to start just by taking a very quick overview of the current system of scientific technology or technical and medical publishing, or what we often refer to as STM publishing. It's evolved a lot over hundreds of years and serves the science and medical communities globally in sharing research. So the industry is highly competitive. We have some 2,000 publishing organizations, Elsevier included. It's estimated that there are over 22,000 peer-reviewed journals, and those are just the ones that are currently indexed in Scopus, so that is increasing every day. And we estimate that scholarly journals publish over 1 million articles a year from approximately 5 million researchers worldwide. So it's quite a huge, huge network of people publishing. So using Scopus data, SciVal is able to generate snapshots of research landscapes within those 22,000 journals that are currently publishing content. This pie chart just shows an overview of research percentage by subject area over the past 5 years. Within those subject areas, you can drill down further. So for example, you can see 14.4% of research being published is in medicine. Medicine is a pretty broad field, so you can drill down further on SciVal and see how much of that is cardiology, how much of that is immunology. But this is just to give us an overview of what that looks like currently. And then looking at that same data in a different way, we can get a glimpse of just how truly global published academic research has become. So the top 5 publishing countries over the past 5 years are the US, China, United Kingdom, Germany, and India. We are still seeing a progressive shift towards more globalized research. I know every journal I work on is getting more and more international submissions, which they're very happy about, and just trying to be more representative of the global research landscape. So the role of publishers and journals has remained pretty consistent over hundreds of years. Although, of course, the way these things are done have shifted dramatically, especially with the digital age and everything that's come along with that. So the four main roles of publishers and journals is vouching for the timing of publication, reviewing the accuracy of research and certifying its legitimacy in the field, making that content discoverable and readable for other researchers, and preserving the scientific record for posterity. So I will talk a little bit later about predatory journals, and that these things very much set publishers and reputable journals apart from predatory journals, in that, you know, preservation in particular, we've seen many times somebody will submit to a predatory journal, they will pay to have something published, and then weeks later it will disappear and it won't be preserved for the scientific record, which is a big shame. So this is kind of the role that we see for ourselves within the publishing community. So next we're going to dig in on how to plan your article. Again, for some of you who have published before, some of this will be review, but hopefully there are some, suggestions and tips in here that will still be helpful. So before you submit anything to a journal, it's useful to think through whether your work is ready for publication. You should not yet consider publishing if your work is very outdated. So we usually say if it's over 5 or 6 years old, you would want to update things before submitting it. You don't want to publish yet or submit anything if you would be duplicating previously published work, or if your conclusions are incorrect or not acceptable. These points are good indicators that your research or your paper lacks scientific interest or does not substantially advance the field, which is something that editors are going to be looking for. You should consider publishing your research if you have information that advances the understanding in a specific research field. This could take the form of presenting new original results or methods, new clinical outputs, new clinical processes, rationalizing, refining, or reinterpreting published results. So if there's a previous study and you've recreated it or you've learned something new about it, it's certainly worth sharing. And I think the field would be interested in hearing that. Or reviewing or summarizing a particular subject or field. So there are different types of reviews, which I did see a question about that in the Q&A earlier. I won't be covering the different types of reviews in detail, but we certainly have resources on that I can share after the meeting. Basically, you just want to remember that a strong manuscript and message is crucial in order to present your contributions to the scientific community. So before you submit anything, you want it to be as strong as possible. So once you've established that, great, my research is current, novel, and ready to be published, it's time to think about what type of manuscript you're going to write. These will differ by journal, but the 3 most common types of manuscripts we talk about are full-length articles, letters, and short communications, and review papers. So full-length articles are the most frequent type. These are often substantial, complete, and comprehensive pieces of original research that are of significance. So generally, when we shorthand mention articles, this is what you would think of. Letters or short communications are quick or early communications of significant original advances. These tend to be much more brief than full articles. So if your research is still fairly new, or if your work is less established in the field, this can be a really great way to get published more quickly and kind of get your foot in the door with a particular journal. For these shorter communications or letters, I would say always, always, always check a journal's author guidelines. They go by different names. Some are called brief reports, some are called short communications, some are called clinical reports. So it's going to differ by your field, and it's going to differ journal to journal. So always look for the author guidelines to make sure that your manuscript will fit what they're looking to publish. And then we have review papers, which summarize recent developments on a specific topic. They also highlight important points that have been previously reported and usually introduce no new information, but they're looking not just at one particular research study, but they're explaining the current field's thinking on a particular topic, looking across a number of research studies. These are often submitted after invitation by an editor, so not all journals accept review papers as standalone submissions. Again, you would have to check the author guidelines for that. So although I've placed on this slide the 3 most common types of manuscripts, be aware that there are many more, and journals are always experimenting with new types of manuscripts every day. So they're constantly changing. People are trying new things. Over the past several years, we've seen video articles become more prominent. So definitely, and I will say this over and over, so I apologize for repeating myself, but always, once you choose a journal, you're going to want to check their author guidelines and choose the type of article that's going to best highlight the work you've done and get your work in front of the eyes of the people that it needs to be in front of. So what makes a strong manuscript? For most editors, strong manuscripts have 3 key characteristics. First, their scientific message is clear, useful, and exciting. We will talk through this in a bit more detail. Second, their message is presented and constructed in a logical manner. They enable the reader to arrive at the same conclusions as the author, and the format chosen best showcases the material. And lastly, they enable the readers, reviewers, and editors to easily grasp the significance of the research. The more effort you put into a manuscript up front, the more likely it is to be reviewed and hopefully ultimately accepted. Editors, reviewers, and readers all want to receive well-presented manuscripts that fit within the aims and scope of their journal. So this is the general structure of a research article. I will go through these in a little bit more detail as well, but basically we have it split into 3 key sections. You have the first 3, title, abstract, and keywords. These all play a very important role in identifying what the article is about and in helping it be more easily found, indexed, and advertised to potential readers. You're going to want to make these sections informative, attractive, and effective so that the article is easy for everybody, for the people you want to find it. Then you have this chunk, this body of the research article, which includes the introduction, methods, results, and end discussion. This is where you will present your work and convey the main message and findings effectively. You're going to want to remember that the reader's time is not unlimited, and many journals have word counts. So as you want to be as concise as possible while still communicating everything you need to here. And then the last group of sections brings up the end of the manuscript and includes conclusion, acknowledgements, references, and supporting materials. However, these are just artificial groupings. The order can change around based on the journal. Some journals request the discussion section to be combined with the conclusion or the results section. Others prefer that it's an independent section. So again, you're going to want to make sure you follow the guide for authors on whatever article you're submitting. Now we have another quick poll. This we're going to get into in a little bit more detail, but what is believed to be the most important part of a research paper? And arguably all of these can be correct. So, but there is one section when you're thinking about furthering the field, furthering science, where you should spend the most amount of time thinking about what story you're trying to tell to the audience of the journal. So we'll give you another minute or two to answer this one. So I can answer a couple of questions from the Q&A while we're waiting. So what is the difference between letters and short communications? This is going to depend on the journal, and they should have it outlined in their guide for authors. Generally speaking, a letter would be something you write in response to a longer article that was already published in the journal. Usually letters shouldn't be new original submissions with their own data, but they can be for some journals. Short communications would never be relating to a previous article. It would be something new. Maybe you're just discovering a new method, or you don't have a full research study to present yet, but it is novel information that you think would be helpful. And that's when it's very that's when short communications can be very helpful. Yeah, I thought this one, I see the results are up, and I did think that this would be a pretty even split, so this does not surprise me. Like I said, you can argue that any of these are the most important. When several years ago, they did a focus group amongst editors, and the conclusion, or at least the most popular opinion, was that the discussion is actually the most important part for an editor to read. And that's because, you have to have all of the other parts right when you're reporting your research, you're going through your methods. Obviously, the abstract is one of the most important things in trying to get it read once it is published. But in terms of an editor looking at your paper and trying to decide if they want to publish it, the discussion is where you have the space to make your best argument of why this is going to further the field. And that's where you can really convince an editor that this research is crucial for their audience and for the people reading the journal. So I'm going to go through the different parts of the manuscript in more detail. But before that, I just wanted to start at the beginning with authorship. So there are a lot of different ways. We find from country to country, the way people handle authorship at different institutions can vary tremendously. It can also vary a lot by discipline. But the general rule is that the first author is the person who conducts or supervises the data collection, analysis, presentation, and interpretation of the results, and also who puts the paper together for submission. And then there's usually also a corresponding author, which can be the first author, so they can be the same person, but often it is someone in a more senior role at the institution, or whose name might help get your paper recognized by the journal's editor. So we always say you should avoid ghost authorship, which basically means you should never exclude authors who participated in the work in some way. And you should also avoid gift authorship, which means including authors who did not contribute to the work. We see there's been, over the past few years, a lot of efforts to crack down on gift authorship. Some journals, depending on the type of manuscript, will limit the number of authors you can have in attempt to, prohibit people from adding authors who didn't actually contribute to the work. But if you, and you also, another note is you want to be consistent in how you're writing the author's names, which you should be able to find on other papers from the journal or in the author guidelines. Okay, sorry, this slide ran over a little, but I think we got the point. So talking a little bit more about the title, abstract, and keywords. So at the beginning, these will be at the beginning of your paper. These 3 sections give the reader a first glimpse of what your article is about. And I think this is why a lot of people consider the abstract to be the most important part of the paper. And I think in terms of discoverability, that is probably very true. So you do want to take care when crafting a title. Again, you want it to be clear and concise if possible, and to attract the reader's attention. Basically, the reader, the first reader is going to be the editor when they're reviewing it, but they should have an idea of what your work is about when reading the title. And then if the title catches a reader's attention, the next thing they're going to look at is the abstract. So the abstract is freely available in electronic abstracting and indexing services such as PubMed, Medline, Embase, Scopus. Because this is the first text they read after the title, it's very important and can help an editor make a preliminary decision on whether to send your paper out for peer review. The abstract should be a single paragraph summarizing the problem you're investigating, the methods you used, the results, and the conclusions. You want to make it catchy and accurate as possible to have the greatest impact. So I would say take your time to write the abstract very carefully. So many authors will actually write the abstract last, so that once they've articulated and put everything together in their paper, they can really make sure that the abstract accurately reflects the content of the paper. So you can pull out a sentence here and there and put it aside for writing your abstract at the end, just to make sure you hit all the points you want to in that abstract. So keywords are the labels or tags for your manuscript and are used by indexing and abstracting services. Most journals will ask you to provide keywords for the article at the time of submission. These will help people to find your research once it's published. You want to avoid words that have very broad meaning. So for example, anytime we run a keyword analysis report for a journal, in the medical field, we often see patient come up as one of the top keywords. Obviously, most clinical journals, you're going to be talking a lot about patients, but adding it as a keyword doesn't necessarily give you an idea of what the paper is about. So keywords should be specific enough to give someone a very quick idea about the content of your paper. You should also be careful only to use abbreviations that are firmly established in the field. So such as DNA. Everybody, anyone in the field would use DNA as a shorthand. But if there are abbreviations that you use in your own work that aren't necessarily field specific, you should probably spell that word out in your keywords, just to be clear. Again, you'll want to check the guide for authors for specifics on which keywords should be used. And I did include a table on the slide just as an example of keywords that are associated with an article taken from Science Direct. So the article title is An Experimental Study on Evacuated Tube Solar Collector Using Supercritical CO2, I do not work in solar energy or anything like that, but I think if you do, you probably are familiar with something like this. And then the keywords, it's not a long list, but I think they're all very targeted and speak to the subject. So next up, we have introduction and methods. These are the next sections that will appear in your paper. The introduction is used to provide context for your manuscript and convince readers why your work advances a field of study. In the introduction, you're going to want to be concise, but you're also going to want to give enough information to understand why the work is important. So this is different than the abstract in that you aren't summarizing, what you did. You aren't summarizing the methods and the results and the outcomes of your paper, of your research. You're just giving a brief introduction and a little bit of background. So introductions, again, are going to differ. For something like short communication, it's obviously going to be much shorter. So this section shouldn't be a full history lesson, but you need to introduce the main scientific publications on which your work is based, cite a couple of original and important works, including any recent review articles that can show that your research is up to date. And you're going to basically use the introduction to give the reader a sense of how your work fits into the literature. You want to also take care not to make citations to irrelevant references, including your own. So some self-citation is fine, but going out of your way to cite papers that aren't relevant is not recommended. Basically, in the introduction, you want to make sure that you're clearly addressing the following. You want to answer the questions, what is the problem you're ultimately trying to solve? You want to identify the solutions and limitations. So are there any solutions? If so, what is the best solution and what are the limitations currently? And what is your work trying to achieve? So you're trying to tell a story about why your work is important and why they should keep reading about what work you've done. And again, you're going to want the perspective to be consistent with the journal you're submitting to. And also original. So it can be tempting to reuse introductions from your previous papers on similar studies, but every paper should specifically have a unique introduction every time. Some of the wording will probably be similar, especially if you've been working on in the same area for a long time, but just generally speaking, you don't want to reuse a full introduction. That will trigger plagiarism software, so you want to be careful about that as well. And then you're going to look at, you move on to the method section. This describes how you studied the problem that you outlined in the introduction. It is important to be very detailed. A knowledgeable reader should be able to reproduce the experiment or the work that you've done based entirely on your methods section. Any previously published procedures don't need to be rewritten in detail. Those can be noted in the references or described in supporting materials. The equipment and materials used in experiments should also be identified along with their sources if there's a chance for variability of the quality of these items. If the work is computational or theoretical, this would be particularly if you're working in mathematics or code or computers, you want to make sure that those analytical methods are described in detail as well. And if a note on ethics committee, so if your work involves experiments on humans or animals, it must follow applicable ethical standards, such as the most recent version of the Helsinki Declaration or any relevant local, national, and international animal experimentation guidelines. So this, sometimes your institution or state or country has an ethics committee that should approve this at the point of undertaking the research. You will also, for a lot of journals, they will expect ethical approval or ethical disclosures in a specific way that they will outline. Some have checklists, some want you to fill out a specific form, but you're always going to want to make sure that you're following ethical guidelines when doing human or animal research. So moving on to the results section, this is where you describe the important results of your research. You should present the results that are essential to the discussion that's going to come next, which means that only data of primary importance should be shared. So you don't need to share every bit of data that's not going to be involved in the outcome and the discussion of the paper. Sometimes this can be included in supplemental materials or in a data repository, but again, you're trying to tell a narrative with your paper, so you don't need to include data that's irrelevant here. You can use subheadings to keep results of the same type together. This is just a suggestion that can help make results easier to review and read. And then highlighting, you're going to want to particularly highlight findings that further the understanding of this field that you're working in, or those that differ from previous findings and explain any unexpected results. Illustrations, including figures and tables, are generally the most efficient way to present the results. I know a lot of people, when they look at an article, will read the abstract, read the title, read the abstract, and then immediately scroll to the tables. And a lot of that is just, that's the quickest way to ingest what the outcomes are. So you want to, if that is the clearest way to display your data, I think it's a really great way to get things across. Again, as I said before, for figures and illustrations, it's critical that they should be used for essential data only. That will make it easier to read and it will tell a clearer story. The legend of a figure or table should be brief and contain sufficient explanatory details to explain the figures without the need to refer to paragraphs of text. So once you've stated your results, you've outlined your data, you've gone through the methods and how you did your experiment, you move on to the discussion section. And again, this is often considered the most important section of the article, because this is where you get the chance to really sell your research and explain why it's so important. A huge number of manuscripts are rejected because the discussion is weak or only includes more description of the results. You want to make sure the discussion corresponds to and complements the results, but you don't want to simply repeat what you've put in the results section. You want to compare other published results with your own, and do not ignore work in disagreement with yours. So you want to confront it and convince the reader that you are correct, or how your research, why it conflicts and why you believe that your research is the correct, has the correct outcome. So there's a lot of debate in science and medical research, and this is really where that would be addressed. You want to be careful not to use the following. So statements that go beyond what the results can support. You want to avoid making these grand proclamations, especially if more research is needed to prove them. And then you want to be very specific in your discussion. So you don't want to use non-specific terminology such as at a lower rate or at a higher temperature. You want to use quantitative descriptions instead. So be as precise as you can based on your data. Then new terms that are not already defined or mentioned in your paper, you shouldn't be introducing any new terms in the discussion section. If you have introduced new terms or new methods, they should be introduced much earlier in your paper, probably in the methods or the results section. Then once you have done all of that work, you move on to the conclusion. And you can think of the conclusion a little bit like a flip of the abstract, or a bookend, another bookend of the abstract. So this is used to show how your work advances the field of study. So you've shown your data in the results section, you've convinced them in the discussion section of why this work is important. And now in the conclusion, you're tying all of that together. You're going to be clear and precise and concise as you can, basically to help the reviewers and editors judge your work and its impact. You want to provide clear justification to help the reviewers and editors understand, think back on what they've just read. You don't want to repeat the abstract. They do serve, the conclusion and abstract do serve different purposes, although some of the same messages will be mentioned. You don't want to repeat experimental results here, and you can use this opportunity to suggest future experiments that build on your work and point out any relevant experiments that may already be underway. The reference list is where you cite the main scientific publications on which you based your work. Take note that there are some journals that also require a conflict of interest statement to be placed before or after the reference section. Again, you're going to want to conform to the Guide for Authors on best practices there. Some tips for having a proper reference list. You don't want to include too many references, especially if they're only tangentially related to your work. You want to only cite things, you only include things that have been cited directly in your paper. Make sure that you've fully absorbed and understood the material you're referencing. So you don't want to just rely on reading excerpts or isolated sentences. This comes up from time to time where an editor will call out problems with a paper because they see that maybe a very highly cited article was referenced in your work, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the outcomes of your paper, and that it's clear that you haven't really ingested the information. So it depends on the editor you get and what the paper is on, but that can definitely be a sticking point for some editors. And then a note on using proper scientific language. When submitting to a journal, again, I told you I'm going to say it over and over, and here it is again, but make sure you've checked the author guidelines for the preferred language and style. If you don't have clear and proper language, editors and reviewers will not grasp the full message or the impact of your work. And that's the whole point of submitting to a journal and trying to publish, is you want to get that out there. So even if your findings are cutting edge and really, really important, grammar errors, language quality, spelling, they can all delay publication or lead to outright rejection of the paper. So the more you can do upfront to get your paper in the best possible condition, the better. It's worth noting that a lot of publishers, I would say probably even most publishers, do not necessarily conduct language editing for all journals. So it's important to do this work on your own before submitting. You want to be aware of sentence structure. So in scientific and medical publishing, sentences should be pretty short. They average about 12 to 17 words each. Short factual bursts. When you put together long, complicated sentences, they tend to confuse readers. So you're trying to convey only one idea in each sentence. That will just help make it more readable and understandable for the editor and reviewers. If you're worried about the quality of English in your paper when submitting to an English language journal, there are options to have a colleague of yours review it. You can also work with a language editing service. So I've listed some in the last bullet point on this slide. Elsevier has their own, that's the one I'm most familiar with, but there are certainly others. There are numerous others out there. And several of these will actually give you a certificate at the end that you can submit with your paper if they require it. Not all journals will, but it can help just to show the editor that you've already done this work and it should be in good condition in terms of whatever language they're publishing in. Most of these services do carry a fee with them, so not always the most popular choice, but again, that's where having an English-speaking colleague help review your paper can really help. And I've seen some authors use an English-speaking colleague, adding them as an additional author and allowing them to contribute more substantially to the work. And that way it benefits them, but it also helps get your paper into the best possible shape for hopeful publication. And because I know in looking at the list of people who signed up for this, that there were a lot of PhD and graduate level researchers on the call, I wanted to quickly touch on turning your thesis into an article. First and foremost, considerable rewriting is going to be needed. And I know once you are done writing, once you're done writing a dissertation, the last thing you feel like doing is, is rewriting it. But you need to think that what you're writing for your institution is going to be very different from what you would be writing for a journal, and what the journal, your dissertation supervisor is going to have a different view on what you should be submitting than a journal editor is going to have. So you don't want to just cut and paste. You're going to have to mold the content of your dissertation to the journal and not vice versa. So I stated some primary differences between a thesis and an article here. Journals will have their own standards, tone, review, and approval process, different formats, different required elements, and language considerations. Editors are going to expect the writing to be succinct and adhere to word limits. So the best journal articles briefly explain the research, describe and interpret the results, and place the work in the context of existing literature. Journal articles are much shorter than a thesis, dissertation, or capstone project, and authors should adhere to any word limits that you're at the journal that you're choosing to submit to. When you're preparing to write a journal article, consider your thesis to be the extended notes. So you can pull from it, certainly, and you should pull from it. You have done all this work, it's all there, but you're thinking about it as you're basically going to have to write a whole new document from those longer notes. It should be a simplified, shortened, streamlined version of the longer academic form. We're going to move on to choosing the right journal, and it starts with a poll. I think you should be able to select as many as you'd like on this one. But basically, again, there's no right answer on this one. This is purely for curiosity of me and others on the phone. What do you consider when you're choosing where to submit your work? So I put some things here. They're certainly not exhaustive. There's certainly other options. So I know some of the popular ones that come up are impact factor, who the editor is, where the journal is based. So, there are many researchers who prefer if an academic society in their country has its own journal, they prefer to submit to that journal. Thinking about audience, the aims and scope of a journal, maybe you just Google time to publication if you're looking at the website. So there's any number of right answers for this, but I thought it would be helpful to dig in on this a bit. And so we'll give you another minute or two here. So I'm looking at the Q&A, so if your country doesn't have a local guidelines or ethics committee to get approval, sometimes you'll have to look to journals in your field on what kind of approval they would want for a research project. And I would recommend reaching out to their editorial office, whether it's the editor-in-chief or an associate editor, maybe in your region, who can help guide you on that, because it's going to differ based on journal what sort of documentation they would want to prove that you, if they're, in the absence of an ethical committee, just making sure that you followed guidelines that they're comfortable publishing. Okay, it looks like it's not letting you choose more than one option, but we can still get a feel on this one. And there's another question, do we have a chance of accepting an article after feedback for a major revision? So most journals, if they feel that they would be willing to reconsider after major revision, they would probably say this in the rejection letter. But certainly we've seen the most common case is that if an article is rejected from one, an author will take the feedback they got from the editor and reviewers on that one, and they will apply it and submit to a new journal. So you kind of get a clean start. And I would recommend that. I think it's often an easier road. They are less likely to dismiss it or already have negative thoughts about it going in. So I think if there's a chance that it would be accepted with major revisions, the editor will say so in their decision letter. So looking at the poll results, it looks like impact factor is by far the top thing here, which is not uncommon at all. Aims and scope, I'm very pleased to see that as high as it is. I think this is, when looking at where to publish, you should always be considering the aims and scope, which we'll get into. And then time to publication with 10%. I think that's a really increasingly important one. Every year when we ask authors what are the most important items in submitting to a journal, time to publication is getting more and more important. So this is really interesting. Thank you all for sharing with me on that. So when you're ready to publish, you've got everything together, it's very important to select an appropriate journal so that your work will reach the intended audience. If your paper is outside the scope of a journal, it will likely be rejected immediately by the editors, not even because of the quality of your work, but because the topic doesn't fit well with the journal. And this is where I would caution using only impact factor, which, because the poll was only letting us choose one, I understand that that's probably not the case, but you want to make sure if you go to the top journal in impact factor in your category, but your article doesn't really fit there, it's going to be rejected. It's going to waste your time. It will waste the journal's time. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. Looking at, you want to, here's a very big point, choose only one journal at a time. You don't want to gamble by submitting your manuscript to more than one journal at a time. It's against international ethics standards, and the editors do find out, and they all talk amongst themselves, and you don't want your name to be on a list of people who have done this. It will make it harder to get future work published. So only submit one at a time. I know it's really frustrating because the process can take a very long time, but it's worth going by these guidelines. Again, you can ask your supervisor or someone more senior at your institution for help in recommending where to submit. They may be more familiar with different journals that are relevant to your field, or they may have a connection to a journal, which can always help. So you really want to look at all the candidate journals. You want to consider their aims and scope. You want to, which is the aims and scope outline what the journal perceives itself to cover. So if you're outside of that, they're unlikely to consider your paper. And then you also want to look at the types of articles they're accepting. So you can look at recently published articles to get an idea of that. And then current hot topics that they're covering. That will all give you an idea of what your chances are. And if you still are struggling to try to find relevant journals, another tip is to look at the articles, the journals in your reference list. They'll often lead you to the right journals just because you are using the same scope of research in the field. And there's another tool you can use. Elsevier has created a journal finder tool that can help you narrow down which journals might be a good fit for your research. So I put the URL at the top there. It's just journalfinder.elsevier.com. Once you go there, you put in the title, an abstract of your paper, and it will generate a list of suggested journals based on basically the keywords in your paper and what it's perceiving to be the subject area. You can also put in the field of research yourself, which will help narrow it down. I think this can be a particularly helpful tool if you're new to publishing or if your work is interdisciplinary. So quickly looking at metrics, again, we saw that impact factor was one of the primary drivers to help choose a journal. These can be very useful guideposts in quickly assessing a journal's quality. But again, the top priority should be overall fit and the audience that you're trying to reach. So CiteScore is the Scopus version. Scopus is a citation metric. It's somewhat similar to the impact factor, but it allows you to compare journals across, it allows you to compare citation patterns across journals, basically. And a quick word on predatory journals. So predatory journals have popped up over the past decade or so, and they often try to mimic well-established journals by using similar names or covers, but they do not follow true scholarly standards, and they often will charge authors just to submit their work or to go through peer review, which is of note. This is different from open access. So predatory journals do not follow accepted protocols and should be avoided. Again, I know many authors who have submitted to these, paid to have their paper published, only to have it disappear. And at that point, you can't publish it elsewhere because it's already been published. And it's a real shame to see that happen after so much work. So I put a couple of resources here, but some brief red flags for possible predatory journals. If they are promising that they will publish your paper within 2 days or a very unrealistic short amount of time that probably doesn't allow for peer review, that can often indicate that it's a predatory journal. If the contact email address is non-professional and non-journal affiliated, so if they're using a yahoo.com email address, that's an issue. Their retraction policy should be the retraction policy should be clearly stated, and copyright, if they're expecting you to give copyright to the journal immediately before acceptance, that is a big red flag. You shouldn't be signing anything over until they've accepted it. If the website contains a lot of spelling and grammar issues or just doesn't look right, if the quality of the images that are published look really questionable and fuzzy, basically, the websites listed here offer some cautionary guidance about these journals. And I would say, you can always ask a colleague or even reach out to, if I'm happy to field these questions too. If you come across a journal that you have questions about, I can try to help you figure it out. Unfortunately, there's no clear list of this is a predatory journal and this one is not. But generally, it just takes a little bit of research. So once you've submitted your article and it enters into this journal publishing cycle, this visual outlines the different steps that publishers, in cooperation with editors and editorial boards, take at that point. I feel like people submit their manuscript and sometimes it feels like it disappears. So we're just going to quickly walk through what happens at this point. So the first thing usually happens is your paper will go to an editor's inbox. They will have a very quick look at it, usually just scanning to see if they think it has scientific merit and they think it fits their journal. They'll generally send it out for peer review. So peer review has become the filter that much of academic publishing is based on. We use it to evaluate the quality, comment on validity, and judge the significance and originality of research. The process also helps to improve the quality of the paper, so reviewers will make suggestions. In a recent study by the Publishing Research Consortium, over 90% of authors agreed that peer review improved the quality of their paper. So as frustrating as it is to get back comments that you should change X, Y, and Z about your paper, the goal is to ultimately improve the research. And you've probably, if you've ever served as a reviewer, you've used one of the online platforms that usually help run this. Once it's through peer review and the article you make the recommended changes, it enters the journal's production process. This generally includes copy editing, proofreading, page proofs, pagination, formatting, journal branding, and then XML, metadata, and identifiers are attached to the papers to make them more discoverable online, and your keywords will help in that regard. They'll check artwork quality just to make sure everything is good there, and everything's ready to go. And so in Elsevier's case, once an XML format for the article is completed with all of these elements, it's then deposited into our electronic warehouse. And from there, the article can be published and posted online as HTML or PDF, or it can be published as a print copy. So we have currently over 80% of research is still published via traditional subscription model, where the author does not pay anything to submit or publish their work. We have been seeing an increase in open access over the past several years. So the brief description of open access is that it requires the author or the institution or funding body to pay an article publication fee. And the published article is then made freely available to anyone as soon as it publishes. They don't have to subscribe to the journal. It's much more shareable. So some journals exclusively publish open access articles. In other cases, subscription journals allow authors to sponsor their articles. So it will be a mix of free to publish and also paid open access articles. So to wrap up this part, I thought it would just be helpful to go over what I think are some of the top tips that will give your paper the best chance of consideration when submitting to a journal. The first thing is you want to find the research. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the top journal in the field, but that your work fits within the aims and scope and will appeal to the editor and to the journal's audience. Next, and I have referenced it over and over, but it can't be overstated enough. You always want to read the author guidelines. Journal editors spend a lot of time making sure they're correct and that they outline what they want to avoid questions. So the more that you can show that you have done that work in advance, they will be very, very happy to receive your paper. If you think you have something to share, but you don't have enough research completed or not enough novel information to add to the literature, consider submitting a short communication or brief report or whatever the journal calls it. They're often easier to get published and they still provide a platform for your work. You can still put it on your publications list, on your CV. It's a very good way to get your work out there. Language editing, again, if you think your paper will require language editing, it's worth addressing this before you submit a paper. The last thing you want is to be outright rejected when you have very, very good research, just because some editors take a harder line with this than others. Some are much more willing to work with you and to ask you to improve certain parts of the writing, and some will just outright reject it, which is quite a shame, but editors are very busy, so that's where they come down on that side. By taking the time before submission to address those concerns, you'll increase your chances of review and acceptance. And I think don't be afraid to reach out to the editor-in-chief or perhaps an associate editor who's located in your region of the world. Regional editors for journals should be able to offer some guidance in submission and publication, and they're often happy to do so. You can reach out with questions about whether your work would be of interest before submitting, or if you have any specific questions. Generally, editors are very happy to help with that. If you do this, though, I would say make sure you're addressing the correct editor. I've had several editors disregard queries from potential authors because they send them a message with the wrong journal name or the wrong editor's name. So you just really want to make sure that you have that correct. And then we're nearly at the end. I have a few slides on copyright and plagiarism. We could do an entire presentation on copyright and plagiarism. But yes, so here we will go through quickly. And again, this is an exhaustive topic, so I would recommend looking into it more if you have questions. So when you publish in a journal, especially if you're publishing for free and not via open access, you're usually going to sign an author statement. And these statements are there, you're certifying that the work was created and conducted in an ethical and compliant manner. For government work, this will be different. So if you work for a government, certain governments expect all of the work by any authors who work for them to be in the public domain or to be licensed to the university. So you just want to be aware of that up front. But most author rights are for a subscription journal. The rights that you retain will be spelled out in the publishing agreement you receive and you sign. Typically, you can still use your article for academic rights. So if you're presenting at a conference or something like that, you can certainly present your work. It's not limited by copyright. It's important to note that publishing agreements will vary by publisher, so you want to read them carefully. Reuse of your work and other scholarly works, even though it's your work, if it's been published somewhere before, you're still probably going to need to request permission to have parts of it republished elsewhere. So you just always want to err on the side of caution with this. And I'm going to skip past this really quickly in the interest of time, but this is just the difference between subscription and open access and author rights. And again, you can find this on the Researcher Academy websites, which we'll link to, and other Elsevier websites certainly have this information. So just a quick slide on plagiarism. So plagiarism is basically using another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And this can include anything from words, general ideas, writings, graphic representations, graphs, diagrams, illustrations, anything that somebody else has put together. If you use it without crediting them, you can be accused of plagiarism. So we always say, when in doubt, you're going to want to just cite it. It will save you a big headache if somebody were to claim that you used their work without proper citation. This includes citing your own work or your advisor's work or your friend's work. It's important, citation's also important to place your own work in context, to acknowledge the findings of others on which you've built your research, and to maintain the credibility and accuracy of scientific literature. So you're basically creating a big web of information that should all connect and reference each other. And other people are going to reference your work as well. So it is the ethical thing to do. It is considered the right thing to do in publishing. Plagiarism is easily avoidable, so you can use ideas and phrases and arguments from sources that have already published. You just always need to acknowledge the source and the original author in your manuscript and in your reference list. If you are accused of plagiarism, consequences can very much vary depending on the journal and on the level of misconduct and on your institution. So some authors, it's as simple as just having the article retracted, and it carries a note that they are retracted for plagiarism, which does not look great for future article submissions. Some receive letters of concern or reprimand. Some academic institutions will carry out disciplinary action against a faculty member if they're found guilty of plagiarism. Very rarely do such extreme punishments, such as losing your job or being barred from publishing, that rarely happens, but it has happened based on plagiarism. So you just want to be as careful as possible and always cite. And so this last poll is just a little ethics question, whether this researcher has violated ethical boundaries. So the story we're looking at is if research notices a paragraph in a previously published article that would be suitable as the materials and methods in his article. The researcher decided to copy that paragraph into his own paper without quotes or attributions. So has he violated ethical boundaries, or is it okay because it's the methods section and that's exactly what he did, so it would be the same anyways? So how about autoplagiarism? Is it allowed to publish a part of your thesis as an article? If your thesis has not been submitted and published somewhere, you can take excerpts of it. If it has been submitted and published with your university or wherever, you're going to want to cite it. You can certainly use pieces of it. Again, I wouldn't recommend having the entire, you don't want to submit your thesis word for word as a journal article. You're going to want to reword it for the journal. But for some sections, certainly the wording will be the same. Again, you just want to cite yourself and cite your thesis and make sure it's clear, just to cover all your bases and make sure that you don't get called for that. And so somebody asked, what is self-plagiarism? So that's a good question. That is if you plagiarize your own work. So if you were to publish an article and then you later are trying to publish another article, but you are using some of the same text without citing the first article, even though it's your own work, it's still considered plagiarism. It carries much less consequences because, again, it is your own work, but you do want to be careful with that. A lot of journals use electronic resources to scan papers, and so if it flags plagiarism, it's going to cause issues in the review process anyways. So as long as you cite it and it's clear that it's your previous work, you won't really run into problems with this. Okay, so 79% said yes, and that is correct. Reusing texts in the materials and methods when you followed the same technique and use the same equipment may be less of a serious form of plagiarism, but it is still unacceptable. So instead, you just want to say that you followed the same technique as another author and cite them fully. that is everything. I've just talked at you for a very long time. I appreciate you all being here and listening. And there have been so many good questions. So I think I'm handing back over to Theron now, and then we'll move into a Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary, for that insight. It was wonderful to see. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have the YouTube live running, and I'm going to ask my colleague Khalid to please ask the first 3 questions to you, Mary, which would come directly from YouTube.
Sure.
Thank you, Mary, for the lovely presentation. We've been receiving a lot of really positive feedback from YouTube, from our YouTube attendees as well. So we've got some questions on people not having funding to publish and thinking that they have budget constrictions towards getting their own research and their own work published. So that would be my first question. There is another question on why does publishing take so long at times, and when should we withdraw our submissions? And there is a third one is might be a bit of a discussion that we can tackle on later webinars and as well. But I would believe that these are the 2 most pertinent questions that we're receiving.
Great, thank you. And they're excellent questions. So not having funding to publish, I think this could break into a couple of categories. I think there's not having the funding to do research, and that is certainly a big problem for many researchers. And I've talked to several researchers over the years who have said they spend all of their time applying for grants so that they can do their research, and then they barely have time to write up their research and publish it. That I don't have a lot of advice on, unfortunately, because it's a known problem around the research community is getting research funding. I do know that obviously, growing your network and partnering with people or institutions who do have more financial resources can help in that regard. But that obviously takes time and often is a more available option to you if you're further along in your career. In terms of not having funding to publish, most journals still allow authors to publish for free. You shouldn't have to pay to publish. So open access is where you do pay a fee to publish and have your article freely available. But you can publish your work for free in most journals. So that, the actual funding to publish the completed work, that should be less of an issue. But again, I certainly sympathize with the budget restrictions for funding of the actual research itself. And I know, especially now, those issues are becoming more of a concern for many people because of coronavirus. A lot of institutions have been slashing research funding already. So I expect this to continue to be an issue. Again, I wish I could give you all research funding, but this is a very known problem across publishing.
So Mary, as just a follow-up to this, there are actually 2 very contrast views that people getting regarding to this specific question. So some people have this idea that all the journals or the majority of the publication is paid for and it's a gold open access model. So that's one idea that I receive at times, and I'm getting some comments that are almost to the contrast, that are saying that isn't the journals that ask me for money are probably lower quality than the ones that are not asking me for money?
Yeah, and those are very common concerns. So I would first address that most journals are not open access at this point, though when you see new journals, and most of the growth in the publishing industry currently is launching new open access journals. But still, like I said, 80% of articles are still published as subscription articles, which means they're free for authors to publish those. So you should be able to find an outlet for your work that does not require you to publish. And again, I think in the journal finder, the Elsevier journal finder I posted, it will give you options that are both paid and unpaid suggestions. So you can narrow it down, you know, if you don't have a budget to publish, that is an option. Also, I know we have people from all over the world here. So there are some gold open access journals that do provide waivers, economic waivers for some countries, from researchers from some countries, whether it's based on GDP or based on trying to get more research from certain parts of the world. That information would be in their author guidelines. But if you are really focused on publishing without paying any of those fees, I would just look for a subscription journal in your field, because you should be able to accomplish it that way. To address the quality question about open access, so this comes up quite a bit. I think this reputation is slowly changing. There are certainly some incredibly high impact open access journals, but the problem is a lot of open access journals are very new, and that means most of them don't have an impact factor or are just getting impact factors. Sometimes they're seen as paying to publish and therefore lower quality because, you know, they're only being accepted for the author, the fee. Again, I think that reputation is slowly changing. Predatory journals certainly don't help with that, because they will often accept anything as long as you pay them. But, you know, the Lancet now has, I think, 2 or 3 open access titles. Cell Press has open access titles. So this is very much changing. I think, you know, open access is new, still very relatively new in publishing. So it's going to take some time, but I wouldn't shy away from open access based on quality. I think it just will require a little bit more research into who the editor is, who the editorial board is, what they're publishing, to make sure that you're comfortable submitting your work there.
Perfect. So just before we go to the question about why does the publications take so long, and when is it too long that I should actually withdraw my submission?
Yes. I'm laughing because I hear this question all the time. So why does publication take so long sometimes? This will also differ based on what field you work in. There are probably, especially if you're in the humanities, you probably experience much longer times for editorial processes. There's been more of a focus on speed in especially physical sciences, but, you know, life sciences and medical, they've been trying to get better on speed to publication. Honestly, the answer is just that editorial offices are very busy. You know, most editors try to look at what's in their inbox in the first week after they've received it. Then you add in time for peer review, then you add in time first for the editorial office if there's anything missing. So if something's in the wrong format, or an element of the article or the submission is missing, it will sometimes go back to the author. That adds time. Submit it again. Once it goes out for peer review, you're at the mercy of people who are doing review work for free. So first of all, if you invite 3 reviewers, you don't know if all 3 of them will accept. You'll probably go through a process of having to invite more reviewers. It's very rare for everybody to accept on first invitation. So by the time you have all of your reviewers invited, it's usually a matter of another 2 to 3 weeks. Then they're usually given 2 to 3 weeks to review. At that point, if they need a tiebreaker, it might go to another reviewer still. Basically, the peer review process can take a much longer time than anybody would like. But again, we are relying on academics who are doing this for free and who are very busy. So that's a big part of it. I think then once it goes back to the author, we do see delays in making corrections or changes, resubmitting, and then needing to get those papers reviewed again to make sure the changes are adequate and addressed the reviewer's concerns. Then once your paper is accepted, I don't know if this was, this was part of the question, but sometimes once a paper is accepted, it takes a tremendously long time to actually publish in the print version of the journal. Usually now, once it's accepted, it's online within a couple weeks, which is good. But if you're looking for that print publication and for it to be a final publication by citation standards, that can take, there are some journals that it takes over a year, which is crazy. But the reasoning behind that is just that they have a big backlog of papers. For a variety of reasons, editors like to control how many articles they publish every year. And so you basically just get into the back of the line, and it takes a long time. But in terms of when to withdraw your submissions, it depends on the journal and on the subject area, I would say. And a lot of it is going to just depend on the circumstances. So I think you should always, if you've reached out to the editorial office and they're unable to give you an update or you don't hear back, and you feel like it's already been a long time, I wouldn't hesitate to withdraw a paper. I think most, if it's just taking longer for review, they should tell you that. They should say, I'm very sorry, and give you hopefully an idea of a timeline when you can expect an answer. If they've stopped communicating entirely, I think withdrawing your paper is probably in your best interest, because you can easily go to another journal and hopefully get a more timely and better communication from the editorial office.
That's great. I think you've covered it from all aspects, Mary. Thank you so much for this. I believe this, we're receiving way much more questions from YouTube, but I'm going to be relinquishing back to Terren. Probably this too many questions from either side, so we're just trying to pick a representative sample. So back to you, Terren.
Yeah, thank you very much, Khalid, and a very big thank you on behalf of the Elsevier team to Mary. And we really appreciate the insight and all the work and effort that's gone into this. We have just a few more minutes left, and we have one last polling question. And this
L'enregistrement a été interrompu.
The audience to please answer. Please rate the publication workshop which you have just attended. And Mary, if you could maybe take one more question from the chat, and if you would like to take this time while people are answering and maybe just address it, you're welcome to do so before we do the closure and the process of the certification and for downloading the workshop information.
Sure. There's a lot of good questions here. One that just jumped out at me is, what if I write the same paper in 2 different languages and publish it in 2 different journals? Is it plagiarism? This is such a good question, and I probably should have addressed it. So this is not technically plagiarism, but you would want to be open with both journals. You would probably need whatever journal you publish it in first, whichever language. You would go to that journal and say, I would like to republish this in English in whatever journal you want to approach about it. They will almost always say, it's okay, you just need to put an attribution line in that saying, republished with permission from, and then the original publishing journal. So that wouldn't count as plagiarism, but you certainly need to make sure that you're clear that it has published previously elsewhere. I did have a situation in one of my journals a couple of years ago where somebody did plagiarize in a different language. So it originally published in a Chinese journal, and then it published in an English journal with different authors, but the content was the same. And this got flagged as major plagiarism because obviously they stole all the content from the paper in hopes that plagiarism software wouldn't catch it, which it did not. This was caught by a bilingual member of the research community. So this can get flagged, but just be careful about it and reach out to the journal that published it first. And so that way it won't count as plagiarism and you get a broader distribution.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for that. And we're just waiting for the final results of the last question.
Tirian, if I could just add as well before we close, just to refer everybody to the chat box where we shared the details for our webinar, which will be this week, about avoiding predatory journals, because we received a lot of questions about that. As well as in the chat box, there's a link to the recording on the presentation about demystifying research metrics. And this was also a frequently asked question. So if you could check the chat box, look at the link and access the recording or register for the next webinar this week, Thursday. Thanks. And we're sharing the poll results now.
Thank you very much for that insight, Dineshri. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the good rating. And yes, this can always be room for improvement in our workshop. And thank you very much for participating